Solomon, and I'm a resident in the area. We are putting on this meeting, obviously, in response to what most of us have faced throughout the year: students, people rioting in the summer, and obviously, police around the world have been treating people that are objecting to the system in a rather heavy-handed and brutal way. So we want to really discuss the intersection between the way that police operate and power that the government hold, and how these things all sort of fit together. We're going to have our two speakers speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion and perhaps suggestions and feedback from other meetings that people have been to, because I know that people do have other things to say, so please feel comfortable to chat away with us after. We have Nina Power, who's Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at Roehampton University, and also involved in a campaign called Defend the Right to Protest. And Lindsey German, who's, I don't quite know what position you are at Stop the War. You're the convener of Stop the War Coalition, the organisers of the largest demonstrations in British history, and of course has had many dealings with police on various protests in different ways. So, and they're going to speak for 10 minutes each, and like I said, then we'll open up. So thanks for coming, and we'll hopefully relax into the evening. So, do you want me to time you and pass your note?
if it would make you feel important.
Okay, well if it gets to 25 minutes, I'll just come and up on the...
Fair enough.
All right, thanks Nina.
All right, well I'm just going to begin with a list of all of the people who the police have attacked this year in the UK, and obviously it's a worldwide question as well, but just to focus on a few of the incidents, because I think one of the things that's quite hard when we think about the police is to hold everything together, and particularly to try and think about the link between what they're doing now, what they've done in the past, the way in which the police relate to the CPS, relate to the government, and so on. Like, I spent months hating on the police because of what they did to Alfie and other people at the students' protests, and it took me a little while to actually sort of see, the way in which the police link up with the courts. It doesn't do anyone any good to simply hate the police, although this is quite important as well. You've got to see it as part of this kind of structural thing. I mean, that's really obvious. I mean, you all know that already, but... Okay, so things that the police have done this year, and groups of people that they've attacked. I mean, what I suppose I'm trying to do in the beginning is just to say, look how many people are negatively affected by the police. I mean, so we've had Dale Farm, we had the eviction of the largest traveller site in Europe, where batons were used and tasers. People were hospitalised during the eviction. Obviously before that we had students and protests in general. We have Hogan Hall, the new police chief, with his policy of total policing, which I think is going to sort of become more of an issue. So we had just massive numbers on the streets, which is something we also saw in the summer with the riots, where people were drafted from all over the country. So you had this situation of sort of naive, nervous-looking policemen and women from Northampton wandering around Brixton looking terrified, and they were there for days. I can't remember exactly how many days. And we had the metal cordon, if you're on the N30 protest, that huge kind of metal wall, which was almost so sort of terrifying, you couldn't quite believe it was real. It was so bizarre. And I think, I was reading an article today by Dan Hancock, which was quite good, about, this is a sort of thing that, it's almost like apocalyptic, like, why do you have these kind of giant metal things? I mean, what's it for? I mean, apart from all of the political ramifications of thinking about walls and keeping people out and so on. We've had attacks on workers, so particularly the Sparks, the electrician protests, and on November the 9th it was very important to the police and for the government to keep the Sparks protesters away from the students, so that they couldn't have a situation where students were marching with workers. That was primarily billed as a student protest. So the police were rather violent towards them, and obviously they were kettled there. In terms of use of kettling, obviously this is something that the police feel very happy to use almost all the time now. And positively, hopefully, there is a kind of test case coming up, probably early next year, which is now 10 years old, in the European Court of Human Rights, relating back to a G8 protest where a woman was kettled in Trafalgar Square, and she was kept apart from her very young child. I think he or she was sort of under a year old, and she wasn't allowed to go and pick up her child, and she's taken this all the way. She's been refused at every level in the English and Welsh system, and she's taken to the European Court of Human Rights. So we may have, her name is Lois Austin, and we may have a kind of positive ruling, because sometimes Europe, or the European Court, likes to slap down English and Welsh policing. So if that goes through, we might have the police having to, very, very slowly change their policy on something like kettling, but that's to come. We have obviously got the ongoing daily harassment of particularly young Black Asian men, but also women as well. That you've all probably looked at the kind of interviews and the documents that have recently come out from the riots, in which police harassment was cited as really the number one factor, and in the kind of frustration, and the words that people are using in those. In the descriptions of why they rioted, if we want to call it that, are very interesting. A lot of the terms are revenge, and retribution and justice, because of the very real sense in which there is never any reasonable comeback. The police are never ever punished for anything they do. And if you harass people on a daily basis, of course they're going to feel rightfully aggrieved. Obviously, we've had the police presence on the wall at the recent strike. We've also had police on the day being called in by university management at Birkbeck to escort strike breakers through the line, and I think they were involved as SOAS as well, where the police were called. And somebody pointed out that in Denmark, where apparently, I don't know if this is true, but apparently when people want to break the picket line, they wear balaclavas to hide their shame as the police escort them through. But we didn't do that here. Obviously, we have questions of the ongoing and increasingly, pressing question of deaths in police custody and also in immigration centres. We know that the last time any police officer was found guilty, and they weren't even found guilty of a manslaughter or attempted murder, they were found guilty of assault, was in 1969, where 2 officers were found guilty of assaulting what turned out to be the first black man to die in police custody, but not the last. We've had several deaths from tasers this year, and one of the kind of excuses, if I can say that in very heavy inverted commas, is that if you give the police toys, they will use them, as someone said. So in August we had 3 people in 8 days were killed by the use of tasers, and often these are people who've called the police themselves. The police somehow end up always killing the person who called them. Cameron said at the time of the riots that the police will get whatever resources they need, and we've seen that kind of discussion going on in terms of the student protests as well. So discussion about rubber bullets, water cannon. We saw overnight courts being used to rush through the thousands of riot cases. Obviously, we've got kind of ongoing things like the use of pictures, so stitching people up and fitting them up, with mug shots. And if you look on the police Flickr site, they have literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from the student protests and the TUC protests as well. Cameron, almost illegally sort of suggested that the courts would automatically send someone to prison if they were found guilty of any participation in the riots. He said, "It is for the courts to sentence, but I would expect anyone convicted of violent disorders to be sent to prison," as if that's not going to have a kind of political impact on what the courts decide to do. And obviously the sheer speed of rushing people through the courts meant that people got incredibly severe and harsh sentences, as we know, and that goes both for the students and for the people involved in the riots. And many of the people involved in the riots were also students, or they were people who wanted to be students but were protesting against the cutting of the EMA and about the introduction of university fees. Cameron said again in August, "Whatever resources the police need, they will get. Whatever tactics the police feel they need to employ, they will have legal backing to do so." Okay, and this is a terrifying statement. I mean, it's not surprising in a way, but it's very, very, very explicit. We have a situation, in which the IPCC, the body that's supposed to investigate the police, everybody in this country thinks that they're profoundly useless. I haven't met a single person ever or read anyone ever saying that the IPCC have done anything. whenever police officers are picked out and named, so the PC Harwood in the death of Ian Tomlinson, who's pleading not guilty, and his trial won't be until next year, we'll get the rhetoric of bad apples, which is the rhetoric that was invoked in the McPherson report, or what followed, about racism. Even though the term institutional racism was kind of used, it was kind of dismissed as being the kind of problem of a few bad apples. So the police will occasionally, if there is obviously someone that they can throw to the wolves, they will. But usually what happens is the police resign before any of that happens anyway, right? So they don't get punished in that way. And when the police do punish themselves, they do so in a very, very secretive way. So we never get to know, basically, if police have stolen, seized property or whatever. In terms of the specific charges, I mean, I already mentioned violent disorder, and as you probably all know, that's the charge that's being overwhelmingly used against protesters and against the student protests. A fray is sometimes used. But violent disorder is obviously a very serious criminal offence. It's the second highest public order offence after riot. And even in riots, is never really used. Riots has a maximum 10-year sentence. Violent disorder has 5 years, but it's the one they're chucking at everyone, basically. And in terms of why this charge is sort of being used, Matt Foote has written about its kind of the last major significant use, which was in the Gaza protests in London in 2009, where 10 months after the protest, the police decided to charge 70 young Muslims with violent disorder, 60, all of them with, what do you call it, good character, so no criminal record. 60 pleaded guilty, unfortunately, perhaps not getting the right legal advice, and went to prison. 6 of the 7 who had trials were acquitted. And I think if we're trying to, this is an overwhelmingly negative picture I'm painting, but if we're trying to think about ways of changing, public response to the police, it's got to be in a way through the juries. So of the students and protesters who have pleaded not guilty, of course they will have trials with juries because it's at the Crown Court. And what we're seeing more recently is a number of very positive results, as students being acquitted, students and other protesters being acquitted, because the juries have found them not guilty. And I think that's one thing we need to do in order to kind of influence public opinion, is to get the message out that this charge is ridiculously disproportionate. It's disproportionate for almost for everything really. And that sending people to prison, now the prison population is now at 88,000, the highest it's been for a long time, is no solution to any of this, nor is evicting people from their houses if they've been accused of being involved in riots. We've seen several councils in London deciding to do that. I think other things we need to try and do in a way is to think about the psychic role of the police, or the role they play even sort of culturally. Why do we have a culture that is so dominated by cop shows and images of the police, and even just sort of detective shows in which the police are always humanised in some way. I'm not trying to sound conspiratorial, but it's kind of I think indicative of the role that they're supposed to play, that we're not supposed to question, and we're never supposed to think that they lie or that they're violent and they do bad things, because of course they're human. TV tells us that they're human all the time. I think people have legitimate fears about their own security, and so a lot of people are wary of directly criticising the police because there's a voice in the back of their head that says, but what if something bad happens to me and I have to call the police? And I think the police play on this a lot. I had a experience of writing something critical of the police, and on the police blog, one of the main things they come back with is a kind of threat of rape, or especially to women, they say, well, in a world without police, we'd let you get raped, essentially, and this is a kind of one of the forms of fear that they will use, they will play upon. And I think there's a long and intricate and difficult question we need to ask about fear of personal safety. Could we kind of think about getting rid of the police or reforming the police without reforming society as a whole, in certain kinds of ways? So that's just a few things that come off thinking about the police, and we can come back to any of them. Yeah.
Shall I just carry on? Okay, well, I just want to sort of follow on from some of the things that Nina said. I mean, actually, incidentally, on the question of rape and rape conviction, of course, you know, rape conviction is so low in this country that the idea of the police and the judicial system are somehow, you know, the thing that's stopping loads of people getting raped and that are actually helping to get people convicted simply doesn't stack up, you know. And of course that's true of a whole number of crimes. And, you know, I think one of the things we need to talk about when we talk about the police and crime and punishment is the whole nature of a society where certain things are crimes and other things aren't crimes at all, or certain things are serious crimes. Apparently when people go and demonstrate, you know, as Nina has said, they get quite serious charges of things like violent disorder. But of course we know, I mean, in the words of Bertolt Brecht, what's robbing a bank compared to owning one? And, you know, the truth is there is what's called white collar crime going on in the City of London among the MPs, a tiny number of whom have ever been convicted, let alone sent to prison. Tiny number, and that was after a huge political outcry. There's all these crimes, the News of the World phone hacking. You know, hardly anybody has been sent to prison, and we know that Rupert Murdoch won't end up in prison about this. None of these people will end up there. So there's a whole question of the kind of nature of society and what becomes a crime and what people see as a crime. And even when you look at the question of people being frightened, I think people are very frightened in lots of ways in a society like ours. And this is partly because we've become a much more insecure society. It used to be that you would have caretakers in flats. It used to be you would have bus conductors. It used to be that you would have park keepers. You have a whole number of people who've all been cut by successive series of cuts and money-saving enterprises and so on. And yet you have more police. So the whole, rather than preventing crime, which is what a lot of these people did, you now have a situation where you don't have bus conductors, so a fight breaks out on a bus, you call the police. Whereas 20 or 30 years ago, it would probably have been dealt with in a different kind of way. So I think when you discuss this question of the police, it really does raise a whole number of questions about the priorities and the values, the kind of society we live in. And I think that that's absolutely true when you talk about protest and the police, which is obviously what we're talking about tonight, and a lot of what Nina's talked about. And obviously I agree absolutely with the points that she's made. I think you have to see policing and the nature of policing that we have as one of the main causes of violence on demonstrations and one of the main causes of violence in society. I organised a big demonstration, or I helped to organise a big demonstration in 2003, which we had up to 2 million people on the streets. We didn't have a single arrest, to the best of my recollection. One person actually died of natural causes on that demonstration, and I didn't even know this till the end. It was all dealt with. It was absolutely peaceful, and it was largely policed by the people themselves. So the level of so-called policing was incredibly low level because there was nothing they could do with that number of people on the streets. And actually, what you find, it's the police response to demonstrations, usually, which leads to this kind of, I mean, they always tell us people who come here to cause trouble. Well, quite a lot of them have got their boiler suits round the corner and are waiting for a chance to put on all their riot gear and have a fight with the demonstrators. And that's what we've seen very recently in the last 4 or 5 years. There's been a big increase in this. Right through the anti-war movement, when it was at its height, there was virtually no arrests, even though there was huge amounts of direct action. We used to block Whitehall, we'd sit down, we'd do all these kind of things. Very, very little ever happened to anybody in these circumstances. And yet, in 2009, when you have the bombing of Gaza, we had a demonstration, I don't know, big demonstration on Palestine, probably 150,000 people there. Most of them went home when it got dark. A load of kids stayed around and got kettled. And it was then that the police started attacking them, and then and this was the first time in recent years that you had these very serious charges, the exemplary arrests, the attempt to criminalise absolutely all of the people on that demonstration. Most of them, not all of them, but a lot of them on that demonstration were young Muslims who were kettled and who were charged and had the most appalling sentences, and many of them believed quite naively, but as many people do, that if they pleaded guilty, even though they didn't think they necessarily were guilty of these things, that they would get fair treatment. They didn't. They got prison sentences. Many of them had their lives ruined. All those kind of things. And since then, we've seen every single demonstration there has been an increased level of policing. It's true with the trade union demonstrations, it's true with the demonstrations in support of the Arab revolutions that we've had. We've had much more aggressive policing over all of these. And I think you have to connect this very much with the crisis in society. I mean, it isn't a coincidence that the worst policing, that if you look in this country, I mean, leaving aside, you don't have to go back to the 19th century when the policing, I mean, in the 1880s was absolutely out of this world, and they closed Trafalgar Square, and there were huge fights, and they killed somebody in a day called Bloody Sunday. That you don't have to go back that far. If you look in the 1930s, very high levels of policing. If you look in the 1970s, particularly around the rise of the National Front and the fascists, very high levels of policing. And if you look again today, you're talking about very high. Very well funded, very sophisticatedly funded. I mean, this stuff 20 years ago would only have been in Northern Ireland. It is now mainstream on the streets of London and other cities, and they talk about plastic bullets and all the other kind of things that they talk about. Again, to the best of my knowledge in modern times, the only people who've been killed on demonstrations have been killed by the police. Yeah. Ian Tomlinson, on the G20 protests. Blair Peach, who was a friend of mine, who was killed in Southall protesting against the National Front when they locked down the whole of Southall, which, as people will know, is a very heavily ethnic minority area. They locked it down. There were you look at pictures of it, thousands of police, like an army, on the streets, and they were determined to crush the protesters. 1974, another demonstration I was on in Red Lion Square. A young student called Kevin Gately was killed, again, trying to protest about the National Front holding a meeting in Conway Hall, which is what was a regular occurrence in those days, that the fascists held meetings in these halls, and it's one of the advances we've made that they're much less able to do this today. Kevin Gately, again, hit by a truncheon, killed in the middle of the demonstration. No policeman has ever, it may change next year, but let's not all hold our breath, no policeman has ever been convicted of any of these things. So, you've got a very, very serious situation, I think very much connected to economic crisis. I think we have to recognise that we are in for a period where there will be this kind of policing. When the Archbishop of Canterbury says, I think there's going to be more riots, as he did this week, because of poverty, because of inequality, because of for all the reasons that people said in The Guardian, a very good survey they did this week, they are going to try to crush the people who riot. That is what they're going to do, and deter future rioters from doing it, to protect property and to protect all these kind of things. And of course, to do this, they have to demonise protesters. They have to make out that really they're just a violent minority, or in the case of the rioters, that they're just sort of feral mobs who are going around, desperate to get a pair of trainers or something else. Now, actually, if you look at what the rioters themselves said, and this is absolutely borne out by all the figures, that actually police harassment was a major part of those riots. And they started in Tottenham when a black man was killed. But where I live in Hackney, when they happened a couple of nights later, I was right in the epicentre of it, not that I was particularly involved in it, but it was right in the middle of, I lived right in the middle of where the riots were. Very, very few shops were looted in Hackney, very, very few. And what triggered the riots, because they started in the middle of the day, was much greater police harassment and stop and search, which they get anyway, particularly if you are black or Asian or Turkish, as there are a lot of kids around my way are. They are stopped all the time by the police. You see it at the station, you see it at all times of day and night, and people are absolutely fed up with this. And, you know, so it seems to me they are going to increase this level of policing in terms of stopping people from standing up for their rights. This, of course, fits in with what the police are there for. The police aren't there to, you know, help little old ladies across the road and all the other things that I was brought up to believe that they were. They're actually there to make sure that the people who own property hold on to their property, to make sure that it is business as usual, to make sure all of these things happen. And of course, as Nina has said, this isn't just the nasty police and then you go to the lawyers and the courts and it's all okay. Because the courts are part of this process. They appear a more kind of civilised part of this process, but there isn't a great deal civilised about people who send you know, the people who put on Facebook as a joke, let's go and riot in some town in, where was it, in Cheshire or somewhere. I mean, Jeremy Clarkson makes an extremely offensive remark about shooting public sector workers, and this is just a joke, and he keeps getting his £1 million a year salary. These kids got 4 years for making a joke on Facebook and the same kind of thing. And this is class justice. It is a system which is there to oppress everybody else. So it seems to me we have to, you know, take that into account. What does it mean for us, just to conclude, is I think it means, firstly, we have to recognise it as such. Secondly, we have to continue protesting. It's you know, it's often said, you know, there is a democratic right to protest in Britain. Well, that isn't how you feel quite a lot of the time. I mean, you know, for example, in lots of cities, not in London, but in Birmingham and places, they try to charge demonstrators for blocking off the roads in the city. You know, you have to pay £5,000 to be able to demonstrate, so half the time they end up going on the pavement. But if you look at every single right in this country, every single civil liberty, it has never come from Parliament deciding these people haven't got enough of a decent deal, we're going to give them a better right to protest. It has always come by people doing these things, quite often illegally, certainly in conditions where they are pilloried and sometimes victimised in all sorts of ways. You have to keep protesting, and I think one of the good things about London is actually there are many thousands, probably tens of thousands of people who do protest on a fairly regular basis, you know, and far more people who are broadly sympathetic to the kind of things that they're outlining. And it seems to me that what we should be talking about is how we extend this protest movement, but also how we do challenge the police. I mean, I think the police are seriously out of control. I didn't get to Trafalgar Square on the demonstration the other week, but the pictures of the metal wall blocking off Trafalgar Square, why? I mean, what for? Apart from to make people feel intimidated. That's what they do it for. And I think we have to really campaign over these things and say we're not going to accept them. It is not good enough. We do believe police, whatever we think about the police and what role they would play in a kind of more equal and socialist society, that actually they do have to be democratically accountable in this society. They do have to, they're supposed to be the servants of the people, and yet actually they're out of the control of practically everybody. And David Cameron's happy with that at the moment, but the truth of the matter is they're not accountable to Parliament, they're not accountable seriously to local councils. I mean, they're accountable supposedly to the GLA, but that means very little. These are the kind of questions we've got to have, because otherwise, if we don't do this, we will see more and more of our rights taken away. And then when we want to protest over all the things that we're going to have to protest over in the next months and years, to do with austerity, to do with wage cuts, to do with all the things that they're offering us, these people who are meeting at a summit in Brussels tonight, then we are going to have to fight very hard to be able to carry on these protests. So.
Thanks, Nina and Lindsey. It's given us a lot to think about and discuss. So I'm going to just sort of loosely sit here and
arrested and treated badly in a cell, obviously they know directly what happens to them. For a lot of people, they don't know that. They haven't experienced it firsthand. They don't necessarily believe what they read, you know, so they don't necessarily think it's true. And it is true that people have, you know, they might think the police behave, even people who are quite left-wing, who might think the police behave badly on demonstrations, don't necessarily think that they're altogether a bad thing. You know, that's, I mean, I suppose that's what, was that what you were trying to say, James? Kind of thing. Oh, sorry, that you were saying. I didn't mean it like that, no, sorry.
No, but the attitudes are very, very complex,
yeah,
and actually the more violent the police become, it can easily produce a reaction which is a load of people think this is good.
But you see, but also one of the things that's been going on for 30 years now is Labour Party in particular has been going on, you know, you people, you lefties don't understand how working class people feel. They do want more protection. They want the gates on their council flats and all the, you know, they want all the things that people do indeed put on their flats. I mean, it's absolutely true. Now, I think you have to see this as part of a general insecurity in society where people worry about crime. I mean, it's very interesting. Crime has gone down. I mean, it's going up again now because of unemployment, but it's gone down over the last 20 years. But people do, if you said that to people, they would think that was counterintuitive. If you went, you know, if you went and said, look, actually, it's much less bad than it was 25 years ago, people say, well, I don't think so. I feel it's more dangerous. Now, how do you explain that? You have to explain it in terms of the alienation that people feel in society, I think, and the way in which they feel cut off from any control over it. Now, I mean, I do agree that that can change very, very quickly, that people who have all sorts of illusions, indeed, even some of the police, I hate to say it, you know, can themselves, in a very big period of social upheaval, can become more radicalised, because what they train the police to do is exactly the opposite. They train them to be cut off from normal society. You know, I mean, in some countries they even have sort of barracks that, you know, the Guardia Civil in Spain and places actually live in separate areas, you know, to keep them away from the local population. There used to be police houses in London and police flats. You know, there used to be all those things. But, you know, I think even when you look at the riots, certainly in Hackney, talking to people and listening to people in the streets, very few people would really kind of condemn the riots and be really horrible, like the sort of stuff you got. But then there's all sorts of questions, people, you know, well, these kids are bad and they should work harder and they should, you know, all this kind of, they don't get up in the morning and all the other, you know, all the kind of general prejudice that people have over stuff. So it's a much more complex question, I think, than just looking at, you know, are people for or against the police.
Amber?
Yeah, I just, not sort of a firm thought process in my head yet, but there's this sense of, what you're talking about, normal people out in the real world, the comment you made, and I was just thinking, well, I think there's a lot of people that would perceive themselves as to be sort of citizens in the state who are not criminals. You know, they don't cross the line, so why should they be persecuted? But I think there is a sense at the moment where the lines of criminality are changing. Things that you might not see as morally criminal are becoming criminalised. Like that.
Cuts, which is introduces another strange question into this picture of them being the kind of armed wing of the state. I mean, you know, under Thatcher, I mean, she kind of upped their pay, improved their conditions, with the full knowledge that she would have to call on them in a couple of years' time, you know, in the miners' strike, you know, so, you know, at least she was sort of Machiavellian about her relation to the police. But now we've got a situation where the ruling class is sort of cutting the police. I mean, of course, police are not allowed to strike. They're fiercely loyal. They're trained in all of these psychological ways to, you know, think of themselves as a sort of a group of people and, you know, set aside from, you know, the moral responsibilities and any other kind of thing that everyone else did. I mean, if I went up and, you know, whatever, smacked a policeman around the head with a baton, I mean, of course I'd go down for, like, you know, I don't know, I can't imagine 25 years. Huh? Is that hard? Well, even if, you know, even the mere threat of it, because of course violent disorder, you know, doesn't actually have to involve any physical contact. Yeah. So, you know, there is that which complicates the situation, and I'm not really sure what that means. You know, if the police are being cut as well, what effect that will have on the way they think about themselves. You know, I mean, obviously it's not, you know, I'm not going to generalise about what the police think about themselves, but, you know, that's kind of a curious thing. You know, that you'd have thought that the one group of people that would be protected would be the police. and they're not. And they have had minor, very, very minor protests, but nothing that's sort of made the news yet.
This would be why on November the 30th someone caught a picture of a copper actually sticking back down one of the posters that had come off loose about pensions. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I love the student chant, "Your job's next."
Yeah.
That was a brilliant one.
Yeah, I mean, actually my brother-in-law is quite a senior police officer
Oh.
down in Devon. And when I say senior, I mean he had to go to the palace because he's just retired. He got a special medal kind of senior. But sometimes it's quite interesting to kind of talk to him because we're kind of on two sides of the same argument, well, a different argument rather. He's obviously kind of like policing and, we're off on demos and stuff. And it's interesting to kind of like hear the kind of tension because he's saying like, we've got to cut our budget, I'm worried about the guys that are going to get laid off. But at the same time, he obviously completely defend, a lot of the tactics being used. I mean, it was interesting to just kind of hear a little bit about the last time the police went on strike, which I think was like the 1930s or something.
1919.
1919, okay.
Yeah.
And from what I recall, I only read very little bit about it, but the state just gave them loads and loads of cash. So, kind of like, in many ways, just bought their loyalty and has generally tried to keep kind of their wages high and make sure their conditions have been quite good. And that seems to have been, quite a kind of constant in kind of policing. I mean, the other thing I was going to say is it's the image used on these posters, I think, is quite interesting because it's become a kind of strange kind of internet meme with this guy.
Whatever. Is that okay with anyone else? Burning questions?
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, I agree with the point about the line. Like, I like the way you phrase it. Like, lines of criminality are changing, and I think we've seen that when we got the pre-arrest around the royal wedding, which is I think exactly what they're going to do again with the Olympics. That was a training run for the public. The international perception of London and Britain, and England. Which is this kind of clean. There's no trouble here. They used the royal wedding and all of those preemptive arrests. And they brought forward lots of the student charges. Of course, they're using counter-terrorist police, in the students, charging the students, by the way. I could talk for ages about the way in which the police are getting heavily involved in campuses, and the kinds of things that university lecturers and teachers are being asked to spy on their students for, and that kind of thing, securitisation of campuses and so on. And I think, it's when you get the situation where people like 450 people or so got a letter the day before the student protest, not exactly saying don't go on the protest, but basically saying we're looking out for you. Try not to do anything that will cause you to be arrested. And these are people who have had charges dropped against them. They're clearly working with a database called protesters, or do you know what I mean? And they just kind of batch send letters out, and of course it's all part of this.
Mail shots,
They could do mail shots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but it's all part of we shouldn't forget. I mean, I agree about the optimism, but we shouldn't forget how much power and weight they've got on their side. I mean, not just ideologically and culturally in terms of the image of the cops and so on, but they have they spend millions and millions of pounds on PR. They are able to leak stuff to the press. They leak stuff about Smiley culture. They put out misinformation or disinformation, I should say. Very, very, very quickly. We saw that with John Charles Menezes, and anyone they basically kill, they will preemptively say, oh, but he deserved it, and or whatever, or he was running, or they just lie. They will lie constantly. Because it gives them a little bit more time and it establishes a media narrative. Look at what they said about Mark Duggan, all that. They do this time and time and time again. And, I think one of the things I haven't quite worked out how to make this argument, but, the way in which the police are bundled in with actually useful services, like ambulances and fire, who actually do help people and save their lives. We're supposed to think, and this is part of the massive ideological way of the police, and I totally agree, by the way, that lots of people do trust the police, and I think and precisely the history explains why the police were brought in, because people were afraid of the militia, because the militia was seen as being violent, and so police were brought in precisely as this kind of safer, nicer option that also did these helpful things in principle. But as we see increasingly don't in practice, and I think one of the arguments we maybe have to make is to say, well, look at the way in which they're not like the other services. Look at the way in which they don't help people in the same way that ambulance workers and fire workers do. And I mean, any ideas about that would be good. because obviously you use the same number to call the police as you would the other ones and all of that. And that's a big kind of ideological sort of thing to get over, and to try and get people to think differently about the police. And there are lots of people who wouldn't necessarily think like that. One final point, I think, is just about your point about surveillance and CCTV and the general kind of criminalisation of particularly groups. I mean, any form of group and any sort of non-commercial relation to public space. I mean, one of the interesting things that Occupy has done, not just in this country but elsewhere, is to reveal, as we sort of knew, just how minimal but amounts of public space there are, how everything is parcelled up and owned by the corporation, by shops, by individuals. And the Occupy thing at St Paul's is very, very interesting. I mean, just in terms of the kind of the way it's caused a sort of physical problem for like the church, the government, the corporation, the police. It's a kind of a literal practical critique of property ownership, which I think is very interesting. As the riots are. I mean, mass collective, disbelief in property relations is a political act. I mean, stealing stuff for free is, if we just want to say that's what it was or part of it, that's political. It's like saying we do not believe in these property relations. And I think one of the early discourses that came out about the riots was about the supposed role of gangs. And if anything, as there's revealed in the videos and the latest research by LSE and The Guardian, was actually gang rivalries were suspended because people were working together. And you get these really, really brilliant forms of like solidarity, in a way, like people operating, precisely as you were saying, there's nothing scary about people working together in this way. It wasn't frightening at the level of being there and participation. What gets frightening is the police relation to it. So I think there is a kind of mass crackdown, not only in terms of surveillance, but any form of group activity, any form of group relation to what we might see as public, but actually probably isn't public. So anyone hanging around on street corners will automatically be seen as a gang. Anyone not sort of scurrying home on their own after going to the shops briefly is potentially criminalised, or is criminalised, is on camera a million times a day, everyone is. And there's so much work to do to get back to any notion of the public, it seems to me, or any form of solidarity and cooperation, because people with vested interests have spent very, very, very many decades making people feel isolated, terrified, atomised, and bringing the technology to do that. And the police, clearly play a massive, massive part of that. I mean, that's why protests are frightening, because people see their collective strength together and they feel it. It's an emotional feeling, as well as a political one.
Thank you, Nina.
I'll just add a couple of points. Firstly, historical observations about the police. In a very good book by a man called John Foster, which was written, I suppose, nearly 40 years ago, about the Industrial Revolution and afterwards in Oldham in Lancashire, which was a very, very radical area. They used to elect the policeman there, and of course he never used to arrest anybody because he supported Chartism and supported all the things that they did. And they had to, and one of the things they did with Metropolitan Police and things like that is to do away with any democratic accountability. And even now, although local authorities do have some control over the police, it's quite a deliberate process where it isn't anything that individuals can really control the police in any kind of way. So they've systematically set out to remove these people from normal structures of society. If you look at the police strike in 1919, which was a very successful strike, but one of the outcomes was to ban the police from being able to strike, and it's still illegal for the police to go on strike. And actually the man who led that strike was sent completely mad, that they persecuted him, and he lost his job, he ended up throwing stones at the window of the Home Office, and various other illegal acts that no doubt didn't get him anywhere. So they consciously set out to destroy the any attempt at democratic organisation, any attempt at the police being able to be, as Nina says, like the firefighters or like the ambulances, or because there are some similarities between these. If you look at firefighters traditionally, for example, came from the army in quite a lot of instances, and therefore were quite conservative, and it took a relative, and some of them still are, it took a relatively long process of trade union organisation and so on to begin to break that down, and going out on strike and things like that. So they deliberately want to stop the police from doing that. But I think that, I suppose the point I wanted to make, I mean, I agree with a lot of what people have been saying, but I just feel the point that was made earlier on, that we are now in a world where we really don't know what's going to happen. In terms, if you look at what's happening with the Eurozone, if you look at all these kind of questions, nobody really, whether or not we expected the riots, nobody has really expected this kind of economic crisis, which, if you look at now, the fuss around 2008 almost looks like the kind of foothills of what is now going to happen. It's going to be much more serious. People are going to take severe cuts in their living standards. There will be some of the dramatic turns of events that we saw in the 1930s and in times like that. There will be, and nobody knows exactly how this is going to pan out. Now, I would have thought, when you talk about the oppressive apparatus, the repressive apparatus of the state, I would have thought two things will happen. They will definitely ring fence the riot gear, the water cannon, all this kind of, these will definitely, they will continue to justify spending lots of money on these things, just as they justify spending money on the wars. It's exactly the same process. They will continue to do it. At the same time, they will cut, I don't know what, the office staff, they will cut the plods on the beat, the more humane things that you might expect the police to do will be the ones that are least cost effective and therefore will be cut back. So I would guess there will be more of a polarisation among within the police and within society. And again, if you look at the strike in 1919, that's where that came from. I mean, it was a huge upheaval of industrial struggle after the First World War. The police hadn't been particularly radical by then, but everybody was radical. There were riots across London and mutinies and all sorts of things in 1919. All the ex-soldiers mutinied in different camps. So all that kind of went on. I think this is what we'll see again. I don't think they'll cut the sharp edge of the thing. In fact, they're spending more and more money on these bloody, how much do these bloody walls cost that they put up around Trafalgar Square? I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds. How much does it cost to protect the House of Commons? If you go anywhere, I went in there the other week, and they have it takes you 40 minutes to get in, and they're supposed to take a picture of you when you get in, so that they detect this dangerous terrorist who's going to some bloody boring meeting about something. and so the guy says, "Oh no, go on." I said, "Why aren't you taking my picture?" Probably stupidly, but I thought, well, why? You've been queuing up for 40 minutes for this. He goes, "Oh, we haven't got time." So there's all this kind of completely mad paraphernalia, and then he hasn't got time to take people's pictures. So it's all, So that's what I think is going to happen. There will be this polarisation, and what we do as a movement, as socialists and all these kind of things, is very, very important in terms of explaining to people how society really works. Because the respectable people, if you like, lots of whom were demonstrating the other week. I mean, I reckon there were 300,000 or 400,000 people demonstrated on the 30th across the country. Big demonstrations in Hertford. There was 1,000 people. Winchester. Yeah, how many in Winchester?
1,000 in Winchester.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what you're talking about is nearly as big as the demonstration on March the 26th. It's on a weekday, which is pretty significant. Lots of people obviously would have gone on it if they hadn't been at work. Now, what that tells you is there's probably 1 million people who now think it's perfectly normal to go out on these demonstrations. And that's quite a big minority. Well, it's only a 60th of the population, but, that's still quite a good minority to be organising with. And a lot of these kind of respectable lecturers and nurses and physiotherapists, I know we exclude ourselves from this category, but there are quite a lot who do think of themselves in this kind of way. They will begin to learn some of the lessons that more traditional groups of workers and more political people have learned in the past. And that really, I think, is the future. And I mean, this is happening not just in Britain, it's happening across the world. I mean, look what's happening to these Occupy people in America. Every city, the police are just going haywire with them. Every single city, And that's, so it will force people to have to think and to have to take sides and to have to decide whether they think they're going to put up with this kind of thing or whether they think they've got to fight for a better world. It's going to lead people in that direction.
And it's a combination of the two, putting up with it and putting a fight out
Yeah, well, then it's which one wins out, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
50-50.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you.